Hi, I'm Brian E. Denton, author of the book A Year of War and Peace and the poetry collection Inspiration. Welcome to my channel. This video is part of a series I'm doing on Dante's Divine Comedy, wherein I'm reading through the entire Divine Comedy, all three books, the Inferno, Purgatorio, and Paradiso, at a rate of 3 cantos or chapters per week. This is kind of my independent contribution to Baylor University's 100 Days of Dante Project. If you haven't heard of the 100 Days of Dante Project, you really should, so don't forget to click through the link that I provide down in the show notes. It's well worth your time. I think you'll like it. If this is your first time visiting my channel, first of all, welcome, and I hope you enjoy what you find here. And if you do enjoy it, please consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel. I've set the goal of getting up to 200 subscribers by the end of October. At the time of recording, we're at 175 subscribers, I believe. So I think it's totally achievable to get up to 200 by the end of October, especially with your help. So I appreciate the help and thank you in advance for that. A quick note on the organization of these videos. They're different parts. You have this introduction, which I'm doing now. This will be followed by a synopsis, where I go over the main plot points and the main action of the canto under discussion. The part after that is the characters and themes section, where I will discuss the characters and the themes of the canto. And then after that, there'll be a takeaway section where I offer my own personal thoughts on the canto, and in particular, how we can use the canto to try to model proper behavior for ourselves and in our real lives. And after that, I'll wrap things up with an outro, and then we'll go wherever the YouTube algorithm takes us. And with that, let's get right into it. Dante's Inferno, Canto 18. We start this canto with a description of this new circle of hell, the 8th circle, Malebolge. And once again you see that Dante the poet has already submitted me to my own personal hell of not being able to properly pronounce the words that he uses in his poem. But nevertheless, he describes Malebolge as consisting of walls, moats, bridges, and pits, and it's presented as a kind of castle. But it's a reverse castle because it does not rise up like a real castle. Instead, it descends downward. Then you have your moats and ditches, which are 10 concentric circles at different levels of this castle. Then you have the bridges, which are narrow stone pathways that radiate out like the spokes of a wheel and go over the moats, the ditches. After Geryon drops off his 2 passengers, he flies away, leaving his 2 passengers to start their leftward descent down into the castle. The first ditch that they come across hold the sinners that had committed the sin of pandering and seduction. And they're being whipped by devils down there in the ditch that they're in. They're also lined up double file, and they're moving in such a way that Dante describes them as having seen happen in Rome during the Jubilee year when the people were moving in double file lines over the Tiber River Bridge. Dante recognizes one of the sinners down here as Venedico Cacciamico, and the two of them, they stop to talk for a little bit. But they don't stop to talk for long because very soon after they start talking, this devil runs up and just starts smiting poor Venedico, telling him to move along. Our 2 heroes continue down the narrow stone pathway, and as they're walking, Virgil tells Dante that he can now get a better look at the sinners. And so Dante does, and what he finds are the seducers, chief among them, Jason of the Argonauts. After that, our 2 heroes continue on till they eventually come to the second ditch of Malebolge. And here they are smacked in the face by an unseemly stench. And the scent that they sense is the smell of shit, because that's exactly what the sinners gathered in this ditch are rooting around in for all eternity. So naturally, there's also a lot of whining. These are the flatterers down here in this ditch. And we meet 2 more sinners. One is named Alicio Intermine, and the other is Thais. And then with that, we get an abrupt ending. For today's characters and themes section, I'd first like to discuss the layout of this 8th circle of hell, Malebolge, and then I'd like to talk for a little bit about Dante the poet's personal philosophy as it relates to his presentation of the sin of fraud as found in this canto. I'm not even sure where to begin discussing the 8th ring of hell because once again, the brilliance of its structural plan is only outmatched by the brilliance of its poetic expression. I suppose that the best place to begin discussing it is to talk about what sin is being punished here and how that sin is being punished here. The sin being punished in this canto, or actually I should say the sins being punished in this canto, are twofold. You have on the one hand the sins of pandering and seduction, and then on the other you have the sin of flattery. And again, the structure of this poem, it's truly wonderful. It's very well constructed. The craft is absolutely brilliant. You have here Dante presenting both types of sins in a very symmetrical and very similar way. What you have first is an introduction of the sin, discussing its inherent qualities. This is followed by a modern example of the sin, and after that, he concludes with an example of the sin from the classical world. And by modern, of course, what I mean is an example taken from the contemporaneous world of Dante. So you get the two Italian characters in the modern example, and then in the classical example, you get Jason of the Argonauts and Thais. It's also really important to understand the topography of this circle of hell. Again, the eighth circle, Malebolge. Picture a giant funnel. You have this wide circular opening at the top, and it slowly narrows as it gets to the bottom. And this narrowing funnel also has 10 concentric ditches running through it. These Dante the poet describes as moats, and they're very deep. They're inescapable. You can't get out of them. Finally, there are different narrow stone bridges, like spokes of a wheel running from the top of Malebolge and meeting down in the bottom. So that's the basic layout. But there are a few things that you have to keep in mind about Malebolge's structure. And the first thing that you need to keep in mind is that Dante the poet presents it as a very mountainous region. Now, as moderns, we might think of a mountainous region as being fun. We associate it with recreation. You know, we put our backpacks on and we go hiking, we go mountain climbing. It's a sense of adventure. It's something that we look forward to doing to get away from our normal lives. But this isn't necessarily the case for the medieval mind. The medieval mind, the mountainous regions, were very menacing. It was associated with danger. When you read old stories from this time period, the mountains and the woods are where the evil spirits live, right? So for the medieval mind, which is when Dante was writing, mountains are menacing. They're not a form of recreation like they would be for us. So that's the first thing that you want to keep in mind. And now a few words about the ditches. These are not simple, shallow ditches. The fact that Dante the poet employs the simile of a moat to describe these ditches communicates to the reader that they are inescapable. They are intended to trap forever anyone who is within them. And indeed they are. They're very deep, and there's no escape. You'll also note in these ditches that we see for the first time devils employed to administer divine justice. They're scourging and they're whipping the sinners in one of the ditches here. Now, you may recall that the word devil figures at the gates to the city of Dis. This is true. But what I'm saying is that this is the first time in the poem where the devils are used to administer the divine justice. On the gates to the city of Dis, they were merely just guarding the city. They weren't involved in any of the punishments of the sinners there. And I think what Dante is trying to say here by having the devils employed in administering divine justice is that he's trying to show once again that the sins of fraud are much more deeper and much more worthy of punishment than all the sins that came before it. Let's also briefly consider the narrow stone path that our two heroes are using to traverse Malebolge. Narrow path. The adjective here is doing the heavy lifting. The path is narrow. To quote the good book, because strait is the gate and narrow is the way which leadeth unto life, and few there be that find it. The path to eternal life is narrow and few will find it. Well, here we have that very thing. There's only two figures on the narrow path. Everyone else, countless numbers of them, are suffering below in the inescapable ditches. Also note that everything down here is composed of dark stone. Not just the narrow stone pathway, but just Malebolge itself, dark stone. And this is meant to represent perhaps the hardened hearts of the sinners who are collected down here. It's also profitable to compare and contrast both the punishments and the environment of the sins being punished in previous cantos and the sins being punished in Malebolge. In terms of environment, let's contrast where the sins of violence in a previous canto were being punished and how the sins are being punished here in Malebolge. You remember that the sins of violence were published in a wide open plain, but here in Malebolge, the sins are being punished in a kind of secretive, hidden, obscured ditch. This fits thematically with the type of sins being punished in each respective region. So with the sins of violence, they're being punished in the open plain because that sin was open and notorious. Not so with the sins of fraud. The sins of fraud are more based on deceit, so they're hidden, just like the sinners are hidden inside these obscuring ditches. It also makes sense to compare Malebolge with the other regions of hell in terms of punishments. Let's look at the sins of incontinence and the sins of violence, which have been punished in previous cantos. Both of these type of sins were naturally occurring. It was the human passion which just welled up and moved or provoked these sinners to commit their sins. There was nothing unnatural about it. So how are these sins punished? Well, they're punished by natural phenomena. Recall Francesca and Paolo. They're strewn about by a wind, a natural phenomena. The wind is blowing them around, and this is how they're being punished. And we have the same with the sins of violence with the sodomites. It's a hard rain falling on them, a rain of fire, which isn't too natural, but at least it's kind of a natural phenomena. But we don't see that with the sins of fraud. The sins of fraud for Dante, they're not provoked by passion alone. They're also provoked by the mind's assent to those passions. So it's actually, this is what makes it so bad, is the sins of fraud are being committed by people reasoning their way, using their God-given reason to commit these sins. And so, therefore, their sins are not punished by natural phenomenon. Instead, their sins are punished by these devilish creatures. This is yet another instance of Dante the poet wanting to stress to his readers his opinion that the sins of fraud are much, much worse than sins of incontinence or sins of violence. And in fact, what Longfellow says about these sins, I think, is really nice. And what he says in his commentary is that fraud is man's peculiar vice. I really like that. So keep Longfellow's words in mind as we read about all the sins punished in Malebolge. We're going to be here for a while. So now let's turn to what Dante's personal philosophy is, at least as it pertains to human nature. And again, this is a personal opinion. This is what I believe based on my readings of the Inferno. So we know that Dante the poet is theologically and philosophically a Christian. But what type of Christian? Well, I think reading the Inferno, one has to come to the conclusion that he's an Augustinian. And what I mean by that is he believes that human nature, without the saving grace of God, is thoroughly and inherently debased and wicked. Now, up front, I'm not a theologian nor a philosopher. So if you want to confirm anything that I share with you here today, you'll probably want to consult with a real theologian or a real philosopher. Again, if that's your thing. But I will say this, that I have read a little bit of Augustine. I've read his major works, the Confessions, City of God, and his work on the Psalms. These are all great and you should check them out. And what emerges from these readings is that Augustine has a very low opinion of human nature. Like a very, very low opinion of human nature. In fact, if he wasn't a Christian, and some would say the Christian, I think that you would probably have to classify him as one of the world's greatest philosophical pessimists, at least as it pertains to human nature. Two quick things to understand what I mean by this. Number one, Christians by definition cannot be pessimists. And that's because the teleology of Christianity is that good will eventually prevail over evil and the New Jerusalem will be established. And we actually see this in Dante's Divine Comedy, because we start with the Inferno, where there's all darkness, all misery, all suffering, and no hope. Then we move up to Purgatory, where hope starts to shine just a little bit, but it's still unrelenting misery and suffering. And then finally, that final step, we're with God in paradise. So there's progression there, and we're getting better and better as we progress. Now, number two, pessimism should not be understood as mere affect or psychological disposition towards depression or unhappiness. Rather, it should be viewed as a philosophy that denies the concept of progress, believes that history is ironic, and sees human nature as fundamentally absurd. Under this conception of pessimism, I would say that there are great parallels between Augustine and Dante and the philosophical pessimists. Just take Dante real quick. 2/3 of his poem, The Divine Comedy, concerns people who are not ready for paradise, who are so broken, fundamentally broken as human beings that they're either punished for all eternity in Inferno, or they're submitted to a burning cleansing and the Purgatorio, where they're made ready for paradise. This is a very dark view of the human condition. And what's more, getting back to philosophical pessimism, is there doesn't seem to be any type of progress made by these sinners at all. I mean, first you have the fact that they're traveling in circles. There's no progress in a circle. There's no progress whatsoever. You're going to be repeating the same path over and over and over and over again. And we see this philosophy of the lack of progress highlighted by the fact that Dante shows both a modern sinner and a sinner from the classical world in Malebolge, or at least in this canto. So we see that despite the lapse of centuries, still humanity has failed to learn anything, and they're committing the same sins over and over and over again. And finally, in terms of tragic irony, the sinners in the second ditch who talk so much shit during their life to engage in flattery are now rooting around forever in shit. This is Augustinian pessimism to the bone. I don't know. I'm not a philosopher. I'm just some random guy. But these are the things that I think about when I'm reading this poem. We can't call this Christian pessimism because there's no such thing, but the Augustinian or the Dantean view of human nature is rather dark, and it's pessimism adjacent for sure. At least I would say so. Maybe. Let me know what you think down in the comments. Today's takeaway is short and sweet because it builds off of the self-deceit Michael Corleone talk we were having in the video for the last canto. And what I want to talk about specifically right now is lines 46 through 67 of this canto. This is when Dante looks down from the narrow stone path at the sinners collected in the first ditch, and he sees a contemporary of his, Venedico Cacciamico. And the story of this man is basically that he pimped out his sister to a marquis. So this guy engaged in a double deceit. First, he deceived his sister by convincing her to become the mistress of this marquis, and then also, as I'm reading into it anyway, he first deceived himself by convincing himself that this was a good thing to do. It would be done for the good of the family. There is some support for this claim, actually in the text, specifically in lines 55 through 57, where Dante the poet writes, "It was I who urged Gisellobella to do the will of that marquis, no matter the foul tale that goes round." I always read this line as saying that this man still, even though he's being punished for all eternity down in hell, is still arguing that he's been falsely accused. The story isn't true. He's saying that it's a foul tale, no matter how it's been told. He's still deceiving himself. This is the worst kind of deceit, self-deceit. Because as we're living in this world, we must first trust ourselves, lest we fall into all manner of sin. So remember, readers, moving forward, the words of the Duchess of York, when she says, "Ah, that deceit should steal such gentle shape, and with a virtuous visor hide deep vice." All right, that concludes my video for Canto 18 of Dante's Inferno. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did enjoy it, please consider giving this video a like and also subscribing to the channel. Remember that we're trying to get up to 200 subscribers by the end of October. At the time of recording, we're at 175 subscribers, so 25 more to go. I think we can do it with your help, so thanks in advance for that. But more importantly than just liking the video and subscribing to the channel is getting a conversation going down in the comments below. And we've already got a lot of regular contributors to the comments, and I thank them a lot for that because it's great. I love interacting with all of you, and I want to interact with even more people. So let me know what your opinion on this canto is down in the comments, or your opinion on my opinion, or, on the poem as a whole. Other than that, if you want to contact me, you can do so on Twitter at Brian E. Denton. And remember that these videos are going to be released every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, all the way until we get to paradise. So the next video is going to be released on Wednesday. Until then, take care of yourselves and others.